한번 오셔서 마음에 드시는 머세디 벤츠를 타보시고 생각해 보십시오.
My name is Tom Hiscox, General Manager of Mercedes-Benz Thornhill. We have been in business in Thornhill area since 1988, just over 20 years. 감사합니다.
Canada's aging workforce is set to squeeze public program budgets as more baby boomers approach retirement, and governments should be doing more to reduce the inevitable relentless fiscal pressure, a new report argues. Canada's younger workers will be faced with a double whammy of slower growing government revenues combined with increased pressure on social programs, stemming from the aging population, CD. Howe Institute Associate Director of Research Colin Busby said. You've got increased pressures for a number of demographics and social programs, predominantly healthcare, Busby, a CO author of the report, told HuffPost Canada. Busby said Atlantic provinces, where governments are already feeling the pinch of an older population, have already started to make proactive changes. I think that same level of understanding and commitment doesn't really exist elsewhere in Canada, he said. One example of possible healthcare policy change is testing an increase in at-home care, as opposed to institutional care, Busby said. That's going to be a very important part of how we figure out who should pay for what, Busby said, adding that we will need to have uncomfortable discussions that we haven't had, particularly when it comes to those sort of old age components of healthcare. The report also points to the federal old age security benefit as a tool the government can use to normalize an older retirement age. Although tax increases are inevitable for the future working population, if the retirement age went from 65 to 67, it would reduce that increase. Busby said Canada's federal government shouldn't be encouraging workers to retire at a younger age. So there has to be a bit of working together between the federal government and the provinces to really look big picture at this intergenerational challenge and try to take it head on, he said. His sentiments in the overall report align with a HuffPost Canada analysis last year that showed Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's lowering of the old age security eligibility age from 67 to 65 will end up costing millennials in additional taxes. Busby pointed to the Canada Pension Plan as an example of how programs can be fixed to make them sustainable. The government raised CPP contribution rates from 6% of pensionable earnings Indiana 1996 to 9.9% in 2003, and created the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board to manage the money. He said that in terms of financing public programs like health care, provincial and federal governments haven't dealt with the effects of the aging workforce because it's a slow-moving problem. We have to be thinking about how to deliver our public programs more effectively, particularly those that try to give better care to elder populations, and we have to start to design our programs in a way that accommodates their needs more effectively, yet also find ways to even out the generational burden here. We've known this is coming for a long time and we never dealt with it, he said. And it's a pity, and I won't be the only young worker that thinks that way. Increasingly, the face of the average Canadian is anything but average. There was plenty of diversity on display in Wednesday's Deposit of Statistics Canada census data, including 250 different ethnic origins across the country, and hints of more to come. Visible minorities could comprise fully 1/3 of Canadians by 2036 as immigration drives population growth not just Indiana the cities, but across the country. The release marks just the latest and second to last in a year-long series of statistical snapshots of the Canadian condition, one that also heralded the return of data from the much-maligned long-form census for the first time in a decade. The census portrait began with a population boom out west and a commensurate spike in the number of households. Wednesday's release showed a similar trend for two groups. The largest overall increase in the Indigenous population was in Western Canada over the last decade, while the share of recent immigrants to the prairies more than doubled over the last 15 years. Immigrants are diffusing across the country, said Michael Hahn, a sociology professor at Western University in London, ONT. What it's forcing us to do, collectively, is think about our entire nation as being composed of immigrants, rather than just major cities. Nearly half of major metropolitan areas are comprised of visible minorities, noticeably Toronto and Vancouver, said Doug Norris, chief demographer at Environics Analytics. But the figures are also on the rise in places like Saskatoon, Regina, Winnipeg, and Calgary, he added. Places that people didn't think were culturally diverse are becoming now culturally diverse. Statistics Canada has been saying through the census that Canada is becoming more diverse, with the latest data dump showing that more immigrants are arriving from Africa than ever before, placing ahead of Europe for the first time. The challenge is to make sure that they fully integrate into Canadian society. So there are challenges coming with this diversity as well, said Jean-Pierre Corbett, Assistant Director of the Social and Aboriginal Division at Statistics Canada. Statistics Canada has already documented a historically high number of seniors, a demographic soon to see ever-increasing numbers of Indigenous people as well as children staying at home longer, more generations than ever living under Canadian roofs, a moderate increase in income levels and the changing face of the working poor. Wednesday's revelations included word that younger Canadians are opting less for home ownership, choosing instead the rental route as housing prices climb ever higher. Aboriginal children face a poverty rate of just over 30% compared to 17% in the wider population, the census found. And more than 7.6 million Canadians identify as a visible minority, representing 22.3%, just over one-fifth of the national population. That's an almost five-fold increase from 1981, when visible minorities made up 4.7% of the population. What comes through is diversity across all characteristics, said Norris, who spent 3 decades at Statistics Canada. Diversity is no stranger to the Cree Nation of Chisasibai. According to the census, the small community on the eastern coast of James Bay has residents whose ethnic origins include the Caribbean, South America, and Africa. The Economic Development Officer for the Band Administration is from Sri Lanka, and has been in the community for almost a decade. The community welcomes them all, but finding housing is becoming ever more difficult. Chief David Bobish said there is a need for 400 more homes in the community to ease overcrowding. Government spending only helps build about 6 houses a year, Bobish added, leaving many families packed into 2 small homes, a common plight across Indigenous communities in Canada. You don't have any choice but to live in a house with other people, he said. Even evictions are difficult. You cannot evict people if they have nowhere to go. In Chisasibai, the community is looking for new ways to build homes and promote private ownership efforts that may not get caught in the latest tranche of statistics. Other communities, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, are looking for ways to make it easier for people to afford a roof over their head. Bobish says addressing an acute housing shortage in his community could have wider ramifications. There are houses that have 10 or 15 people living under one roof. This is what creates a lot of social issues. The federal Liberals will spell out their long-term plan to reform Canada Post today, making permanent a freeze on converting home delivery to community mailboxes. But some 800,000 families who have already started walking down the street for their mail won't see door-to-door delivery restored, a move that's sure to upset postal workers who have demanded the post office turn back the clock on mailbox conversions. Rather, federal officials tell the Canadian press that the government will be setting up a task force to confront any accessibility concerns those 800,000 households and anyone else may be facing, with an emphasis on better serving seniors and people with mobility issues. The Liberals vaguely promised during the 2015 election campaign to save home mail delivery after the previous Conservative government decided to end it as a cost-saving measure and instead deliver letters to community mailboxes. Public Services Minister Carla Qualtrough is expected to roll out the new plan at a Canada Post plant in Mississauga this morning. Officials say she will also introduce changes to the financial rules that drive Canada Post, emphasizing the need to make a profit and then reinvest the extra money back into the Crown agency to improve services and become self-sustaining over the long run. Senior leadership at the post office, which is in the midst of a large-scale turnover that includes a search for a new CEO, will also be mandated to establish more cordial labor relations. As well, officials say the government will push Canada Post to promote its remittance services, encouraging more customers in Canada to use the postal service to send money to friends and family abroad. The Canadian Union of Postal Workers has called instead for a reintroduction of banking services at postal outlets as a way to make money, an idea that has been rejected by the agency. The government will also ask Canada Post to capitalize on a boom in its parcel services, since that's where the money and growth are. While mail deliveries by postal workers have been declining drastically in recent years, Canada Post has seen parcel delivery volumes soar, up by almost 39% in the third quarter of 2017 alone. And Canada Post will be expected to look at how other countries have used weekend delivery or parcel lockers to bolster their postal service revenues. The government will also be looking at ways to leverage the fact that Canada Post has a presence in even the smallest of Canadian communities, and could be used to deliver other government services. Canadian real estate prices were the fastest rising in the world just a few months ago. Now we're claiming the opposite title, as the market explores where prices should be. Newly released Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas Fed, numbers show a decline in home prices for the third quarter of 2017. This is the first time in over 5 years that Canadian real estate prices have declined for a quarter. Despite the quarterly decline, prices still remain significantly higher than the year before. The Dallas Fed publishes home price indexes for academics and researchers. Today we'll be looking at their Real House Price Index, RHPI. It's the same concept as the HPI that Terranet and the Canadian Real Estate Association, CREA, produce. In fact, they actually use CREA data to create it. They also combine it with data from Royal LePage, Statistics Canada, and UBC. This helps them get a cleaner and more comprehensive look at the general market. The inflation-adjusted score tracks the aggregate of urban markets across the country, and is updated quarterly. You won't be able to use these numbers to determine how much you have to pay for your neighbor's house. Instead, you should use these to get a better read on national home buying trends, and the economy in general. Housing is a very large industry in Canada, and a slowdown would ripple throughout the economy. Canadian real estate prices dropped the most since the early 1990s, according to the Dallas Fed. Real home prices, aka home prices adjusted for inflation, fell 3.82% in the third quarter of 2017. The single quarter decline is the first decline since 2012, and the largest since the first quarter of 1991. This is the largest single quarter decline in the world according to the Dallas Fed's Global Index. The second largest decline they observed was in Italy, where prices fell 0.38% in the quarter. Despite the large quarterly decline, Canadian real estate prices are still much higher. The index is 7.44% higher than the same quarter last year, almost twice as much as the aggregate index for other countries. The increase is quickly tapering from peak growth observed in the first quarter of 2017. The quarterly decline is significant, but even so, the market is outperforming many other markets. Remember that a single data point isn't indicative of a trend, but the size of the decline is worth taking note of. This marks a break in the 5-year upward trend the country has seen, and might just be a breather, like in 2012. It could also be the beginning of a broad market correction, like that seen in 1990. The most interesting takeaway is this break occurred starting 6 months before OSFI mortgage rules were rolled out to cool conventional mortgage borrowing. The rule changes add significant uncertainty to the market, especially after prices are starting to look a little softer.